Story 1. It was another day at the patrol base about a mile away from the Iraq-Iran border, a place known for the highest casualty during Iraq-Iran war during the 80s. We'd usually black out the base at night for security with only a single light or smoking pit in the middle of the base. It was my first week there, and I was on base security with this one other guy from another unit. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. when this other guy started telling me the rumors of ghosts surrounding the areas. Such stories were common here. People often shared stories of hearing voices, feeling unexplainable cold drift, running into people that did not belong, and never seeing them ever again. But I hardly thought much of them. It was common for people to be tired and a little on edge in a creepy, quiet place. Every so often, I'd hear the guys talk about the half-body ghost. It was supposedly a soldier from the 80s, back when things were chaotic here. The story went that he was caught in an explosion and only his top half survived. Somehow he was still alive for a bit after, dragging himself along until he finally died from his wounds. People said that this half-body soldier still haunted the base, moving around just his torso, head and arms, with nothing below the waist. It sounded ridiculous, but it was enough to give anyone the chills if they thought about it long enough. I didn't take it seriously. It was just one of those stories that spread around bases like a joke. But at 2 or 3 in the morning, with nothing but darkness around, those stories had a way of messing with your head. And so just like everyone else, my partner thought it would be great if he kept talking about the ghost stories, despite being a little spooked. He tried to keep it cool, but his eyes kept darting around like he was expecting something to jump out of the shadows. I listened to his stories, more to pass the time than anything else, but I could feel the cold tension in the air. The whole base was silent, not even the usual wind or animal sounds you'd sometimes hear. Right around then, there was a noise ahead of us. It wasn't footsteps exactly, but something was moving. It was like a heavy dragging sound, slow and steady, like something was being pulled through the dirt. I told myself it was just the wind or some animal, but I could feel my heart starting to pound. My flashlight was in my hand before I even realized it, and I clicked it on, shining the beam in front of us. The light swept across rocks and sand, but there was nothing there, just empty ground. The sound continued though, and I felt a chill run down my spine. My partner and I looked at each other, both of us unsure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. We decided to check it out, moving forward slowly, trying to figure out what could be making that noise. After a few steps, the noise stopped and everything was quiet again. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling though, like we weren't really alone. I was about to suggest we head back when I noticed my partner a little farther ahead than I'd expected. I hadn't seen him walk over, but he was standing perfectly still, facing away from me. Something about it was just wrong. I called out to him, asking if he'd seen anything, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, motionless. I called again, louder this time, but he didn't respond. Getting closer, I felt my skin prickling with fear. The silence was thick, like something was holding its breath. When I got close enough, he finally turned around, and what I saw almost stopped my heart. His face was covered in blood, smeared across his skin, and his eyes were wide open, blank and empty. But that wasn't even the worst part. His body was only half there, just the top half, torso and head, arms dangling by his sides. There was nothing below the waist. I stumbled back, a surge of panic taking over, and I was breathing hard, heart racing. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. This was the very thing I'd thought was just a stupid story. He started moving toward me, or gliding really, because there were no legs, nothing but empty space below him. I took a few steps back, trying to keep my eyes on him, but he kept coming, inching closer with that same eerie look in his eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, frozen with terror. Finally, I snapped out of it and turned to bolt. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard, face first into the dirt. My flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling a few feet away, the beam bouncing across the ground. I scrambled to reach for it, feeling my hands shake, but as soon as I reached it, everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning, and a few soldiers from my unit were standing around me. Some of them looked worried, others seemed ready to laugh. I was lying in the same spot where I'd fallen, covered in dust. My head was pounding, and I felt disoriented, trying to remember what had happened. The details came back in a rush, and I started telling them about what I'd seen, hoping they'd believe me. I told them they could ask the other guy I'd been with. He'd seen it too. But when they went to find him, he denied it. Said he'd never been on duty with me that night, hadn't been near base security at all. I couldn't believe it. Was he trying to mess with me? Or had I imagined the whole thing? The guys around me looked skeptical, exchanging glances like I'd lost my mind. They wrote it off as a bad dream or a hallucination, maybe from the long hours and lack of sleep. After that night, I didn't talk about it much. I could tell no one believed me. But every so often, someone would give me a strange look, or I'd catch a whisper about the guy who saw the half-body ghost. They could laugh all they wanted, but I knew what I'd seen. Even now, thinking back on it, I can still feel that chill in my bones. Maybe I'd just been tired. Maybe it was my imagination, playing tricks in the dark. But part of me isn't so sure. Some things, especially in a place with so much history and pain, seem like they leave a mark. Story 2. I've spent a lot of nights out on the deck of our ship, camera in hand, surrounded by endless stretches of Pacific waters. As a photographer for the Navy, I've gotten used to these quiet, solitary shifts, where it's just me and the sounds of the ocean under the stars. Most nights it's routine. You see some strange things, sure, but after a while you learn to shrug them off. The ocean has its secrets, its legends, stories passed around in whispers about ghost ships, unexplained lights, and people who disappeared and were never seen again. You hear so much that it becomes background noise, like the hum of the engine or the slap of waves against the hull. But there was something different about that night. The air felt heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual, as if it was pressing in on me. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, just one of those odd nights where the world felt a little off, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness. I remember checking my camera, fiddling with the settings, just to keep myself busy. That's when I saw the first one, a small, empty boat drifting in the water not far from the ship. It was just a little thing, beaten up and weathered, like it had been out there for years, maybe decades. It wasn't unusual to see debris in the middle of the ocean, but something about this boat felt wrong. It was like it was watching me, even though I knew that was impossible. I tried to push it out of my mind, but then another boat appeared a few nights later, and then another, each one just as abandoned, but somehow eerie in a way that I couldn't explain. Some looked worn, splintered by time and salt. Others seemed almost fresh, like someone had been living in them recently. One boat had empty food cans scattered on the floor, another had old tattered clothes tossed across the seat, and a few had half-burned candles melted into the wood. I could feel my skin prickling, my instincts telling me that something was wrong. But curiosity won out, and I kept snapping pictures, documenting the strange, lonely remains of these drifting boats. Then one night I saw him. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and the ocean was calm and quiet, the kind of silence that gets under your skin. I raised my camera and focused on a new boat, a smaller one, drifting just outside the ship's spotlight. I zoomed in, expecting to see another empty shell, but there was someone there. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a pile of rags or debris. But no, there was a figure sitting there, dead still, facing out toward the horizon. My breath caught. The figure's skin looked wrong, washed out in gray, stretched tight across its face, almost translucent, and their eyes, those wide, empty eyes, were open, staring into nothing, or maybe into everything. I didn't even notice the smell until I felt it clawing at the back of my throat, thick and sour, the unmistakable stench of rot. It felt impossible, the way it seemed to reach me from so far away. I could feel it wrapping around me, clinging to my clothes and skin, even though I knew it shouldn't be able to reach me at all. But there it was, heavy and real. I forced myself to take a few pictures, telling myself that I'd look at them later, that I'd be able to make sense of this in the daylight. But it was hard to keep my hands steady. I couldn't shake the feeling that this figure, This thing was aware of me, that it was waiting for me to see it. The boat drifted out of view, slipping into the darkness, and I was left standing there, heart pounding, the smell lingering in my nose long after the boat was gone. I knew I'd have to tell someone, show someone. I could hardly believe it myself, but I had pictures. That was proof. When my shift ended, I went straight to my quarters and pulled out my camera, scrolling back through the photos with a mix of dread and curiosity. But as I looked, my stomach dropped. Every photo was pitch black, completely empty, as if I'd never even taken them. I went through each one over and over, but there was nothing. No boat, no figure, just darkness. I tried to convince myself it was some sort of technical issue, a glitch, maybe even a trick of my tired mind. But those eyes haunted me. The memory of that face, gray and stretched, with empty eyes staring into the black, refused to leave. It was as real as anything I'd ever seen, more real than any story or legend I'd ever heard. I still think about it, sometimes late at night, when I'm out there again under the stars. I wonder if the figure is still out there, drifting in the darkness, waiting for someone else to see it. I know what I saw, even if I can never prove it, and that's the worst part. Those eyes will haunt me, just like they haunted the empty boats, just like they'll keep haunting anyone who dares to look too closely into the dark waters. Story 3. I'll never forget that day. For almost a year, I'd been part of a small crew assigned to decommission an old World War II-era building, 3 floors high and built right into the side of a hill. It was an old SIF, heavily secure, with 2 floors of offices on top and a basement floor where we had warehouse space, a cafeteria, and a loading dock. Everything had been cleared out, and at that point, I was the last one still working in the building, save for the lone guard posted at the facility's front gate. My job was almost done, just a few more truckloads of office junk, furniture, and equipment, and then I'd be out. So there I was sorting the last pile of stuff in the loading dock when something odd caught my eye. There was a small hole in the floor with a bit of light coming up through it. Now I knew the layout of this place pretty well, and this was supposed to be the basement. Solid concrete. But here was this little hole, shining with light from somewhere below. Curious, I peeked through it, and to my surprise, I could make out a dusty old desk and a chair in what looked like a forgotten office room. My mind was racing a bit. Had we just found a hidden sub-basement? With everything cleared out, it didn't make much sense for an area to be left unexplored, but this room was clearly still there, right below us. I went on a bit of a hunt around the floor and eventually stumbled on a narrow staircase hidden behind some old file cabinets. It led down so naturally I went. The first sub-basement was dark and dusty, filled with old office furniture and equipment that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air felt heavy and stale, and I remember thinking to myself that this was eerie, almost like the building was keeping secrets of its own. But that wasn't the end. The stairs kept going down and down. I ended up finding 5 floors of sub-basements altogether, each one colder and darker than the last. The lower I went, the more I felt like I shouldn't be there. I can't explain it really, but there was this overwhelming sense of dread that grew stronger with every floor I descended. It was like the walls themselves were pressing in, heavy with the weight of years and memories. Finally, I reached the bottom, the 5th sub-basement. It was pitch black down there, and the only sound was my own footsteps echoing in the silence. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, muffled crying. It sounded like a child, a little girl. At first, I couldn't believe it. There shouldn't be anyone here. No one had been in this building for ages, and I'd only just found this place myself. But I could hear her, clear as day, crying out for help. I followed the sound and eventually found her, a tiny pale figure crouched in the corner. Her leg was pinned under a massive piece of concrete debris, like a broken pillar had fallen and trapped her. She was dressed in this old-fashioned, worn-out dress, and her face was smudged with dust and tears. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, begging for help. My heart was pounding, but I didn't think twice. I had to help her. I tried to lift the debris, but it was no use. It was way too heavy for me alone. I told her I'd be back with help, and I sprinted up those stairs faster than I ever have in my life. As soon as I burst out of the stairwell, I went straight to the guard and some other guys in the area, barely catching my breath as I told them what I'd found. Everyone looked at me like I was crazy, but after a few moments of convincing, they agreed to come down and see. Together we went down, floor by floor, all the way to the 5th sub-basement. Only when we got there was nothing. No debris, no girl, no sounds. It was empty. I looked around, confused and panicked, insisting that she was just there, that I'd seen her and talked to her. But one of the guys said, "There's no way anyone's been down here. No one even knew of these sub-basements. You were the first to open this place up in years." My mind was spinning. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. But standing there in that pitch-black silence, with everyone looking at me like I'd lost it, I started doubting myself. Could it have been my imagination, a trick of the shadows? But the memory of her face, her voice, was burned into my mind. It felt too real to just be a figment of my imagination. I left that building soon after, and I'll admit, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something was wrong with that place. I still don't know what was real and what wasn't. But every now and then, I think about that little girl, trapped and crying in the dark, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's more to that building than anyone will ever know. Story 4. After my time in Vietnam, I was stationed at an Air Force base in Greenland. The place was remote, nothing around for miles but snow and ice. The weather was brutal. We'd get hit with blizzards that were so bad, they could shut the whole base down. When that happened, we'd go into lockdown. Each section of the barracks had to do a head count to make sure everyone was inside and safe. The storms were dangerous, no joke. They could come out of nowhere, and in a matter of minutes, the visibility would drop to zero. We had cables strung between the buildings. You'd clip a carabiner to your gear, and if you got caught in a whiteout, you just followed the line back to shelter. People had died close to the base, just a few meters away from the barracks, because they'd gotten lost and froze in the storm. That was the kind of place it was. But after a while, something strange started happening. Every time we went into lockdown for a storm, we'd hear these screams. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a wolf or something. But after hearing it so many times, I started to wonder if that was really the case. These screams were human, only something bigger. Not like any animal I'd ever heard. They sounded like someone in pain, someone who was being tortured. The weirdest part wasn't just the screams, though. It was what would happen after. Every single time we'd hear the screams, the engine room would be destroyed. And I mean destroyed. Tools all over the place, papers scattered like someone had tossed them around, and heavy machinery knocked over. There was even one time a jet engine, a huge one, was picked up and moved. It wasn't like the wind had blown it either. This engine weighed thousands of pounds, and there was no way something could have moved it that far. It was like someone, or something, had picked it up and just dropped it 30 feet away. At first, I didn't say much. The others just shrugged it off. Animal, they'd say, or crazy storm messes with your mind. But I wasn't so sure. Something about it felt off. After a while, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided I was going to figure out what was really going on. It wasn't an animal, and I didn't believe it was just bad luck or some freak accident with the machinery. One night during a storm that was supposed to be particularly bad, I decided to take a walk. Stupid, I know. But I thought if I could just find some explanation, some clue to make sense of it all, maybe I could stop feeling so damn paranoid. I grabbed my gear, clipped into the cable, and headed out. The wind was howling and the snow stung against my face, but I kept going. I had a feeling, call it instinct, that I had to get closer to the engine room again. As I got closer to the building, the screaming started. It was louder this time, like it was coming right from the storm itself. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of it. It didn't sound like a human voice anymore. It sounded deeper, almost like a growl mixed with a scream, and it was coming from somewhere near the base. I kept walking, driven by something I can't really explain. I reached the back of the engine room, and that's when I saw it. There was something out in the snow, something huge moving between the buildings. It was so big I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like a giant walking shadow, maybe 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur. It wasn't just tall, it was massive, like a bear but on 2 legs. Its arms were swinging, and its steps made the ground shake. I could hardly breathe. I stood there, rooted to the spot, just watching it. I don't know how long I was out there, but I couldn't look away. The thing walked right past me. I could feel the chill from its fur as it passed, and then it stopped like it sensed me there. Slowly it turned and looked straight at me. Its eyes were yellow, glowing in the dark. I could hear it breathing, deep and slow, like it was sizing me up. It didn't attack, though. It just stared for a few seconds, then turned and disappeared into the storm. I don't remember how I got back to the barracks. When I stumbled inside, I was shaking, soaked to the bone. I didn't say a word to anyone. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, but I knew what I'd seen. And the next day, the engine room was wrecked again. Tools scattered, machinery moved, everything in chaos. After that, I couldn't let it go. I told a few of the guys about what I'd seen. They laughed it off, called me crazy, blamed it on the isolation or the cold getting to my head. I tried convincing them, but they thought I was losing it. Eventually, I stopped talking about it, but I wasn't about to give up that easily. So after lots of back and forth, got some cameras and set them up around the base, aiming one right at the engine room. Every time a storm hit, I'd make sure those cameras were on and recording. I wanted proof. I was ready. But then, nothing happened. We had storm after storm, and there was no screaming, no destruction in the engine room. Like ever again. It was like whatever I'd seen had just vanished. The guys joked that I'd scared off the ghost with the cameras, but I knew better. I started wondering if it had ever been there at all, if maybe the isolation really had gotten to me. A few months went by, and the storms kept coming, but that scream never returned. The engine room stayed untouched, like whatever was out there had moved on. I reviewed the tapes night after night, but all I saw was snow and darkness. Not a single glimpse of the creature, not a sound, just silence. Eventually, I left the base and moved on to my next post. I tried telling people what I'd experienced a few more times, but no one ever took me seriously. I guess I can't blame them. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it either. But I know what I saw that night. I know what I heard, and I know it was real. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that scream in my head, that bone-chilling sound cutting through the storm. Maybe it was just the cold and isolation messing with me. Or maybe, just maybe, there really was something out there in the blizzards of Greenland, something that didn't want to be seen and that I'll never be able to prove. Story 5. I don't talk about what happened that night, not to anyone. And when I think about it, I start to wonder if maybe I imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep messing with my head. But then again, I still feel the scratch on my leg, and I can't shake the memory of that hand. It was late, a couple of days into another stretch out in the middle of nowhere, far from any kind of base. It was just the usual, endless patrols, digging fighting positions, and keeping an eye out for anything that might go sideways. We hadn't slept much, like usual. The constant movement and lack of rest start to mess with your mind after a while. Everything gets blurry. It's like being stuck between two worlds, half awake, half asleep. I was in one of those fighting positions, trying to catch a few hours of rest, and I swear I could feel something. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a small animal. My feet had been sticking out of my blanket, and I felt this light, almost ticklish sensation, like something was tugging at my toes. I kicked my foot, thinking it was just some animal, maybe a fox or something. But when I kicked again, my foot hit something solid, like bone. It wasn't a furry little animal. No, it was sharp, like nails. I froze, my heart started pounding. I pulled myself up, trying to make out what was in front of me. The moonlight was dim, and I could barely see anything. But I swear, what I saw made my stomach turn. There at the edge of my position was a hand, a woman's hand, just clawing at my foot. Her nails were long, sharp, and dirty. It wasn't natural. It was like the hand had been reaching for me, like it was alive. I don't know what happened next, but I panicked. I scrambled away from it, knocking over my gear, and didn't even stop to think. My legs felt like jelly as I backed away, watching that hand just twitching on the ground, reaching out toward me. It was like it wasn't even attached to a body, just a hand reaching out like it was trying to drag itself closer. I turned around and bolted. I didn't even care about my rifle or the rest of my gear. I just ran. My heart was in my throat and my mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell I had just seen. But when I looked back, there was nothing. The ground was empty. No hand, no sign of anything. I stared at that spot, trying to make sense of it, but it was like the night had swallowed it whole. I was breathing hard, still on edge, but I told myself it was just a hallucination. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe I imagined it. I don't know. The next day I didn't bring it up. Who would believe me? I didn't even believe it myself, but that hand kept nagging at me. It didn't feel like just a trick of the mind. It felt real. A few days later, I was digging for another position. I had to get my head on straight, focus on something else, you know? But as I dug deeper, I hit something solid. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but when I cleared the dirt away, I found something strange. It wasn't a rock. It was a bone, a human bone, a piece of a skull sticking out of the ground. I froze. I cleared the rest of the dirt away, and there, buried in the dirt, was a whole body. Not just one, there were several. A whole damn family. Just buried out here in the middle of nowhere. I don't know how long they've been there, but it was long enough for the bodies to be just skeletons, their bones white and brittle. There was no sign of how they gotten there, no trace of who they were. It didn't make any sense. Who buries a family out here in the middle of nowhere? I called over the rest of the team, and we dug around a little more, but no one seemed to think anything of it. They just chalked it up to some old bones, maybe from a past battle, or maybe something even older. No one seemed too bothered by it, but I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something off about the whole situation. I kept telling myself it was just bones. That's all it was, just a skeleton. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't ignore what happened the night before. The hand, the nails. I went back to the spot where I'd seen it. I couldn't help it. Something in me needed to know. Maybe I was just trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But when I looked down, I saw it. There was a scratch on my leg. It was small, but deep enough to bleed a little. And I realized it was from nails. Woman's nails. The same nails I'd seen on that hand. I don't know how I didn't notice it sooner. Maybe I didn't want to. Everyone else figured it was just the skeleton, some old bones from who knows when. But I knew what I saw. I knew that hand had been real. I don't know what it was or what it meant, but I know it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. I still can't explain it, and I don't want to. Some things are better left alone, but every time I look down at that scar, I remember. And I wonder if I'll ever really know what happened that night, or what clawed at me in the dark. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.